There's been a Metroidvania that, for a long time, I've been avoiding, despite how many people on the internet have told me how good this game actually is, and despite the fact that it came out at the beginning of 2016, I've managed to avoid it this entire time. By the way, you should consider this video as not safe for work, because even though I'm not showing any nudity, there is going to be a lot of anime girl skin, so you have been warned. I can be pretty stubborn, but even for me, this was an act of defiance, an act of self-preservation, if you will, because in all honesty, I had a pretty big reason for avoiding this title. Well, a pretty big pair of reasons. This is Rabi Ribi. I don't know or really care if that is the proper pronunciation for this game's name, but I think that you can understand my reluctance to have this game tainting my Steam library. I've probably titled this something like Sussy Metroidvania, because, let's be honest here, one of the two starring characters of this game is designed in such a way that I've probably been placed on a list just by owning this game. But, like I've said, I've been told by so many people how actually good this game is, in spite of its outwardly horny appearance. And I was entirely ready to keep my Steam library clean from this game. But it just so happens that the developer has very recently released a new game called Tevi. They sent me a key for that game, completely unprompted. So what did I do? I went out and bought the game that one of my Discord members has affectionately titled Satan's Rabbit Game. For, research. Naturally. That nickname is well earned, and the reasoning can fit very neatly in two distinct jugs. One is very obviously that this game is extremely horny, not just in its well-endowed, all-woman cast of characters equipped with more cleavage than the Marianas Trench, but because this game is as hard as my But because this game is extremely difficult. Rabi Ribi lives in an extremely rare, but becoming more common, mix between two genres. This is a bullet hell Metroidvania. A bullet hellvania, if you will, defined by its precise movement, myriad options in combat, difficult bosses, and of course, dodging about 1,000,000 bullets that are being thrown your way at all times. I'm pretty sure this is the first game of its type that I've played, bullet hellvania, not horny game, but there's a few on my list that I've been wanting to tackle for a while that are probably much better than this one, like Touhou Luna Nights for example. But alas, this is the one that I hit first. And even though games like Hollow Knight and Ori have sections where you're asked to dodge a barrage of pain being flung your way, that's not exactly the main focus of their combat. From the first to the last boss, you'll be asked to dodge melons of various colors with increasingly complex patterns, as well as their bullets. And even though some of these patterns look completely impossible to avoid, a lot of them aren't quite as bad as they might look. If you're not very familiar with the concept of bullet hell games, there's an often used mechanic that these games absolutely rely on to make the games not only possible, but probably more fun as well. In most games, your hitboxes vary intuitively roughly the size of your character. If your character seems to get hit by a bullet or an attack, you will take damage. That makes sense. In a bullet hell game, though, this interaction is slightly more abstract. The character's hitbox isn't the size of the character's model or sprite, instead it's generally a very small box somewhere around center mass. I call this somewhat abstract because in my mind, it's simulating that one scene from High School of the Dead that I know we've all seen. I mean, good luck animating that dynamically in a video game. This means that the game demands some pretty precise movement from you, and it wants you to learn and intuit the size of Arena's hitbox as you engage in combat. It's not the easiest thing to grasp, but if you keep it in mind, then you can slip through some truly heinous-looking cracks unscathed. Oh, that's the character's name, by the way, Arena. She's a rabbit. Literally. By some magic spell or something, she was turned from a rabbit into a human bunny. Like, this is quite literally a Playboy bunny costume that she's in. Let's go ahead and ignore the moral ramifications of turning a literal beast into a fully functioning human woman with real anatomy and the naivety of a child, because that could be a whole video on its own by a creator with a much better understanding of the arguments relating to this. If I'm being honest, I had a pretty hard time really giving any amount of craps about the story after the opening scenes established the premise. It honestly feels like a lot of nonsense that's loosely strung together for the sake of some semblance of continuity to make the game flow in some way or another. The world really doesn't feel like it makes any logical sense from a functional point of view without taking the effort to further abstract the world's design in your head even further than the game itself already does. And honestly, I think that's perfectly fine. I don't think that every single video game needs an airtight plot to keep it held together. As long as the game is entertaining, I couldn't care less if it was held together with half-melted duct tape. That may keep it from reaching the heights of the greats of the genre, but not from being a memorable game in its own right. And as I alluded to earlier in this video, and even in a previous one, I found that Rabi Ribi is quite a lot more fun than I expected it to be. Sorry to burst your bubble, but I've played a horny game or two in my past, one of which is even featured on this channel in one of the best videos I think I've ever made. And out of curiosity, I've looked at the reviews and screenshots of many more since working on that video. Overwhelmingly, and I'm not saying that this is the case 100% of the time, the gameplay of these games looks to be absolutely trash, or a visual novel. Some might say what's the difference, but it depends on what you like. Anyway, those games exist often only for one purpose: to deliver a bit of smut that you have to earn. Good game design often seems to be secondary to the goal of these games, which is why Last Evil was such a surprise to me as a, newcomer to this style of game. Despite that explanation, and despite the outward appearance of Rabi Ribi, this game is, in fact, not one of those games. It even goes so far as to tell you this itself in one of the game's more questionable moments. And yet, even with that disclaimer, there is no shortage of titillating images fed to you throughout the game's runtime. It goes as far as it can without crossing that PG-13 border, which I at least appreciate for the sake of my own dignity. Without the more risque elements of these risky games, Rabi Ribi has to lean on its gameplay a lot more than it would otherwise, and in that department, the game delivers. The game follows a relatively simple loop, at least once you exit the opening chapters. You're tasked with finding some magic users to help power up a mysterious stone that exists in the town. So you go out, find a couple of scantily clad women to do bullet hell with, convince them to come back to your place, and then with their help you're sent to another dimension to hopefully discover and fix whatever is causing bad things to happen back in your home dimension, and maybe getting sexually assaulted along the way. Oh, this game is something else. You do this quite a few times before finally coming face to face with the final boss, which takes the form of a lengthy multi-phase battle where resource management is key. This means getting good enough at the fights that you take few enough hits that you can finally make it through to the final fight and win. The game prepares you pretty well for this gauntlet, all things considered. There are a ton of boss fights peppered throughout the experience, each giving you a unique challenge to overcome with their little gimmicks that tailor the fight to the individual boss's one-dimensional personality. And even though there are enemies throughout the game's world that you'll have to deal with as you explore, for the most part they're simple little diversions that don't ask much from you in terms of execution to get past. So even though the number of boss fights might feel like it can get repetitive or annoying, I'd go so far as to say that they're necessary for teaching you and giving you the ability to practice with the game's demanding combat. I'd even probably say that these boss fights are the game, because the combat is by far the biggest element of Rabi Ribi. Well, maybe the second biggest compared to these. But at the end of the day, this game is still a Metroidvania, and that means a large, interconnected world map full of items and secrets to collect and discover. From the very beginning, the game doesn't shy away from teasing you with paths and collectibles that you have no chance of reaching on your first pass through the area. And even though the game offers a fast travel system, the difficulty of the bosses and the absolutely awful and completely unorganized menu of that fast travel system incentivizes you to trek through the world manually to collect more power-ups in an attempt to make the bosses easier. And that brings me to a system that I haven't really seen in a Metroidvania game before. Metroidvania-style games tend to only offer a single difficulty mode most of the time. The more items you collect, the easier the game gets. It's an intuitive system that makes you feel directly rewarded for going out of your way to collect more items and power-ups that may not be strictly required, while also providing unique challenges for those who may take bosses in a different order. Rabi Ribi's world design is pretty good, offering a lot of paths and a lot of connections between zones that make travel a breeze a lot of the time. But like I said, as good as the world design might have been from a gameplay point of view, the game's main draw is its combat. And if the combat were to be invalidated or made too easy because you're the kind of person who absolutely loves to explore and collect, would that undermine the core of the game? I've seen some people argue that, yes, for games like this, being a completionist is detrimental to a game's difficulty and experience, often making the game too easy or much easier than it otherwise should be. Of course, that argument puts us all on a slippery slope, but it's definitely worth thinking about. But what Rabi Ribi does is allow you to have your Metroidvania cake and eat its combat too. Messy metaphors aside, when you start the game, it allows you to choose between allowing the game to scale with your collectibles or being more static and allowing you to outscale the game's combat by virtue of you being a good little collector. Unfortunately, I don't feel like the game does a great job of explaining what this system is or how it actually works, and its explanation winds up being confusing and may even make you feel like collecting more items is actually bad for you, which is thankfully not the case. On top of that, there's also a more traditional difficulty system that you can use to further tailor the game to your individual skill level and patience, with the ability to lower it with an NPC in the game if you feel like the game is demanding too much from you. This game offers so much to engage with and collect, and a shockingly open progression path that seems to be relatively rare even within this genre, which is renowned for its freedom. The game gives you direction but allows you to forge your own path and fight bosses and collect power-ups in an order that you choose, at least for the most part, which, to my understanding at least, allows for a wide array of challenge runs where you fight bosses in different orders with fewer power-ups, and even skipping some seemingly required abilities altogether. What seems like a lewd, shallow game at first glance shows surprising thoughtfulness in its approach to world design and progression. It often felt like I had 2 or 3 different boss fights available to me at any given time, so if one fight felt a bit too hard when I found it, then I felt comfortable knowing that I could temporarily abandon it for another path. And that's not just one point of the game where you might be able to tackle a few major bosses in any order you please. This is a majority of the game after the first couple of chapters. It's seriously impressive. Of course, the game isn't without its flaws. As thoughtful as the world design is when it comes to progression, it's less thoughtful in other areas. The fast travel menu is one of the most confusingly laid out collections of areas that I've ever seen for navigation, to the point where I legitimately had to search for where I wanted to go every single time. I think that the only one I was able to memorize was the main town. Every other location was so unintuitively placed within the menu that I had to search every time. I know it seems like a petty, nitpicky complaint, but it shocked me how unorganized and confusing this thing is that I just had to mention it. There's a system where you can purchase temporary buffs from the people you've invited into the town. It's a great little power boost to help you with bosses that you might be having trouble with, but talking with all of these NPCs, one at a time, going through their awful dialogue, and a menu to confirm that you want to spend the money, every single time that you want to collect these buffs, it's just frustratingly tedious. And to make it even more annoying, some of the game's quests are started or continued by talking to these NPCs. And because all of these NPC buffs have the same event marker over their head as if they had a quest, it's impossible to tell if this person has a task for me or a buff. I ended up missing one of the quests for a long time because of this. Also, the game has a badge system, very similar to Hollow Knight's charms, and may even be partly responsible for inspiring it. These badges offer a lot of options for the player to customize their playstyle a bit, but I feel like there just might be too many of them, and a number of them just seem boring, like adding health or mana, or even trading one for another, which is less boring, but still not very interesting in terms of gameplay. Give me more badges like the one that drops a healing carrot whenever I get hit, and less like the one that increase my attack by 1 or 2 damage. It does offer a lot of min-max potential for the discerning power gamer though, and that at least is appreciated. There's so much more that I could complain about at length, like the lack of well-telegraphed secrets in the world, the tacked-on feeling of the consumable and inventory systems, and the frustrating stamina system that feels more annoying than fulfilling to interact with. But at the end of the day, this is a relatively small indie game from 2016 that hit at a time before this subgenre really blew up and was iterated on like mad. So for that reason, I can forgive a lot of the jank. Besides, I don't see a ton of value in overly nitpicking an 8-year-old niche indie game about overpowered half-naked anime women trying to kill each other. Rabi Ribi was the first bullet hell Metroidvania game that I've played, and even though I did enjoy my time with it, I've found that it's not exactly my favorite style of this genre. I really love the more deliberate mechanics of games like Hollow Knight and Ori, with less focus on bullet spam and more on interesting arrays of attacks to learn that aren't just bullets. But that's just me. It won't be the last one that I play though, especially as the genre hybrid seems to be growing. Touhou Luna Nights is absolutely on my list, but next up, I'll be tackling this studio's most recent game, Tevi. If this kind of game is your jam though, I've already explained how competent the game is at a base level and how much there is to engage with and how much freedom that it offers. But even past that, the game has an extensive post-game filled with bosses that I've read are absolutely vile when it comes to their difficulty. In a good way, I think, at least from what I've read. So even though the game didn't take me a ton of time to beat the main story of roughly 15 hours on hard difficulty with the bosses scaling with my item collection, there's so much more to collect, discover, and fight if you end up loving the game. I just didn't vibe with it enough to engage with it past the main story, but just know that there's a lot to this outwardly sussy-looking game. If you can stomach this game's art, the absolutely inane story, and its terribly horrible writing, Rabi Ribi offers a Metroidvania experience that is unlike anything I've played so far. I have to wonder how many people were chased away by the cover, but I also have to wonder how many were brought in by that same cover. If you're even a little bit curious or perhaps even a little bit horny, this game is well worth your time. Just be ready to answer any questions from people on your friends list once they see you playing it, and maybe practice your alt-tabbing skills for the inevitable moment when someone decides to enter your room while you're otherwise engaged. Anyway, thanks to all my channel patrons for helping fund my degeneracy, and thank you for watching all the way to the end. And to prove you have, I'd like you to make the most lewd comment possible without being obvious about it. Give me your best double entendre. Remember, the goal here is to not trigger the spam filter, so be classy, please. With that said, I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.